This video is meant to accompany the section of the World in 1750 reading that discusses the Tokugawa Shogunate. Again, it is meant to accompany, not replace. It does not have all of the details that you will find in the reading. But the Tokugawa Shogunate ruled Japan from 1600 to 1868. The shogunate will come to an end in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, which, among other things, will return significant power to the emperor. The Tokugawa Shogunate, again, is the ruling part of Japan. Japan is a series of islands located to the east of the Qing Empire, which was China, mostly China. Also, Korea. So, Japan's nearest neighbors today or back then were China and Korea. Notice that in the 1700s, there is only one Korea, no divided Korea. Okay, Japan is a series of islands. Fancy word for that is archipelago. And it is made up of four main islands, many small islands, but four main ones. Starting from the north, you have Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. The Tokugawa Shogunate is a military dictatorship. Despite this, as we generally think of countries ruled by the military as being very conflict-ridden and violent, this is actually a very peaceful time for the nation of Japan. And there are several reasons for this. Most of it has to do with the strict political and economic control that the shogunate kept over Japan. They very strictly regulated trade, farming practices, and foreign relationships. Okay. They also, and this is both a political and a social aspect of the shogunate, kept very tight control over the daimyo. And the daimyo are the upper levels of the military. They are the elite. In European countries, they are comparable to the nobility, the dukes and the knights and such. They were kept very tightly controlled in Japan. They had to pledge absolute loyalty to the shogunate. They also were kept busy traveling. One of the things that the shogunate does is move the capital of Japan. It is moved from what at the time was the very large city of Kyoto to the much smaller coastal, at this time not even a city, of Edo, and Edo is modern day Tokyo. And all of this travel from Edo to their homes spread out across the country kept the daimyo very busy and very tired, which limited the amount of plotting and scheming against the shogunate they were able to pull off. Another way the shogunate was able to keep control was by stripping most of the power from the emperor. Now, the emperor of Japan, and there is still an emperor of Japan today, that family that rules Japan, quote unquote, rules Japan, can trace their line back thousands of years. And the emperor is, or was, viewed as something of a god. But politically, the shogun stripped the emperor of really all power and just kept them. The nicest way is they were kept as a figurehead. Reality is that the emperors during the shogunate were mostly just kept at more or less as hostages. Okay, lived lives of luxury, but, not really allowed to do much. Okay. During this time, the shogunate also imported new scientific methods of farming, built new roads, and just in general made travel across Japan easier. Interaction with the environment, travel across the country. Social structure in Japan is fairly rigid. Like most countries during the time, we can demonstrate Japanese social structure in a triangle. In this particular case, the higher up you go, the triangle, the higher your social class, which means in society, the more power you have. So at the top, you have the warriors, the shogun, the daimyo, samurai. Underneath that come farmers, then artisans, people who make things. And at the bottom, you had merchants. Merchants, people who buy and sell stuff, were not looked upon really favorably at all in Japanese society. They were actually quite looked down on, okay, because they were not seen as making anything. They didn't contribute in any way. Now, in most societies, the top of the social pyramid not only has the social power and the political power, as they do in Japan, they also had most of the economic power. They had most of the money. And the people at the bottom had the least social and political power, but also typically no economic power. That will not be true in Japan. Many of the daimyo are poor. They have titles and high birth, but they don't have much money. Most of the farmers can really only be described as peasants. Okay, so you have the top of the social structure in Japan not really controlling the economic power of the country, whereas you have the bottom of society, the merchants, who will increasingly have large quantities of money. They will, as time goes on, become more and more wealthy, and will also, as time goes on, become more and more frustrated by the fact that their money cannot get them political power or social influence. Japan, like Korea, is heavily influenced by its much larger and more powerful neighbor of China. So, among other things, that means Japanese culture is highly influenced by Confucianism. Right? Confucianism is a somewhat complicated system of beliefs, but it mostly has to do with honoring the relationships and honoring the power dynamic of the relationships. So, people owe respect to their emperor, and in exchange, the emperor is supposed to care for their people. That's the basis of the relationship. But whether it is older people to younger people, okay, younger people owe respect and obedience to the older people. Older people, in turn, should be taking care of and teaching the younger people. Or parents to children. Okay, children owe respect and obedience to their parents. In exchange, parents should be taking care of their children. Men and women owe obedience and respect to men who are considered socially higher. In exchange, the women should be, cared for. Okay. And these relationships influence much of society across Eastern Asia. So you see the influence of Confucius not just in China, but in Japan and in Korea and in some other countries. Right? And this is part of why you see so few women really achieving much of anything during this time. Confucian ideals are used to keep women in Asian countries in very subservient roles. Okay. Because women's basic function in life was to obey. Okay. Japan will, under the shogunate, heavily limit access of the Europeans to their country. Most European countries are completely denied access to Japan, and that has a lot to do with attempts by European countries to send Christian missionaries to Japan. Um, Religion in Japan is complicated. Um, Japan is heavily influenced by Confucianism, which is not a religion, it is a system of beliefs or that governs society. Japan is also largely a Buddhist country. Most people in Japan practice Buddhism. And at the same time, most people in Japan also practice a more traditionally Japanese religion of Shintoism, which is able to very happily coexist with Buddhism. Most people practice both Shinto and Buddhist principles. And there was a lot of outrage at Christian missionaries coming into Japan. Christianity is banned through most of the country at this point in history, and Japanese Christians are persecuted. Okay. The one exception to the ban on Europeans was the Dutch. By the way, the Dutch are the people who live in the Netherlands. And the Dutch were allowed to establish one trading post in Japan in the city of Nagasaki. Nagasaki will play an important role in Japanese history in the 20th century, as well as it is one of the two Japanese cities to have nuclear bomb dropped on it during World War II. Okay. So the Dutch are allowed limited access to Japan. Because of this, European scholars and historians for centuries have said that Japan was closed off to the world during this time. And that is not true. Japan trades heavily with its Asian neighbors, mostly with China and Korea, but also with Vietnam and other neighbors. Okay. But despite remaining mostly closed, European influence does begin to creep in. Japanese intellectuals, Japanese thinkers, and scholars become very interested in books that they're able to buy from the Dutch traders on new science and technology, mostly on science and technology. Okay. As time goes on, a reliance on trade and increases in banking and manufacturing are going to grow, putting more money and eventually more power in the hands of the merchants. And this will eventually come to cause conflict in Japan, who for centuries had considered money to essentially be immoral. But slowly, things in Japan will begin to change, and slowly the power of the shogunate will weaken until several factors will come together in the mid 1800s to finally overturn the shogunate and restore power to the emperor.